The work of the great 20th century American author Ernest Hemingway has been given a trigger warning due to concerns over his language and attitudes. Publishers Penguin House have reissued his novels and short stories with a cautionary note. For example, his famous debut novel, The Sun Also Rises, has a disclaimer now which says publishers will not censor the book, but nor do they endorse the content. These warnings have major implications for the publishing world and beyond, and here to discuss them, I'm joined by the writer and historian David Oldroyd-Bolt. David, welcome. Now, I have to be honest, this is the latest in a long sequence of similar stories. We've had warnings splashed on Agatha Christie, P.G. Wodehouse, Roald Dahl, now Ernest Hemingway. Is anyone safe?
It seems a rather odd thing that a publisher should be expected to endorse the content of a novel. After all, it is make-believe. You know, nobody is going to expect that when you're reading Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, you think it's a really good idea that someone should go around in a big cart collecting children. Nobody's going to expect when you read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that you think it's really great to punish children in the horrific ways that Dahl describes. These are works of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, you say that as though... they should know this, working in the publishing industry. What do they make of Stephen King? I mean, do they endorse Killer Clowns? I mean, do they have to put...
Run and hide in a cupboard by any means. I think it's a really odd concept too that when you take something like The Sun Also Rises, which is written in 1926, is set just after the First World War and is about Hemingway and his friends, but is very clearly set within a fictional realm, that there should be a need at a centuries removed to remind people that this was written a century ago.
Yes.
I mean, all they have to do is look at the front and see that it was written a long time ago.
I think...
And people thought differently in the past. There's this bizarre idea that everything should be rewritten to make it relevant to the current day. And to me, that strips away all of the joy of reading fiction. Yes. When you read, say, Clarissa from the 18th century, or you read the works of Trollope from the 19th century, or you read the works of P.G. Wodehouse, we mentioned, from the early 20th century, you do so in part because you want to know what it was to live in a different age.
Yes.
Even if, in the case of Wodehouse, these are highly fanciful ideas about a very narrow selection of that age. But you don't do it because you think that you're somehow going to find a reflection of the current age.
But it all seems so arbitrary. I mean, the authors that they choose, you mentioned Clarissa, the Richardson novel, but, you know, there's a rape and she dies in that, but sorry to spoil it, but there's no warning on that as yet. There's no warning on some of those classics. But what I'm saying is that will that now become the norm, do you think? Well,
I think if the publishing staff, who it does seem from... We've had analogous cases, for instance, with Nigel Biggar's book on colonialism, where the original publisher, Bloomsbury, the staff went mad about it, and so it had to be published by someone else. It seems that it's a publishing staff driving it, rather than necessarily the executives. So if they start to extend this weird fear and also control, I don't see why it shouldn't apply to the entire canon. But it seems to me a very strange thing to enter an industry which is primarily about telling stories and then to try to control the way in which those stories have already been told. You know, we're not talking about contemporary works of fiction. That's a rather different discussion, and I think one that's good for a future programme, Andrew. Yes. We're talking about things that have been published for, in some cases, centuries. So what do they expect to achieve by this?
Am I being mean by maybe suggesting that maybe the people making these decisions don't read very much? Because, you know, the fact that it's almost as though they've just come across Hemingway,
indeed,
and they've just realised, what will they make of Titus Andronicus? What will they make of Ovid's Metamorphoses? They'll have a heart attack.
Well, I think they probably have never read those things.
Right.
And if they have, they've misunderstood them. It's an extraordinarily odd thing. We think it's 60 years, 61 years, in fact, since the trial of D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was only published, despite being written in 1928, it was only published in an unexpurgated form in 1960. Yes. There was a trial, it was prosecuted on... The publisher was prosecuted under the Obscenity Act of 1959, and then, the judge... after taking evidence from people like E.M. Forster and many other literary luminaries of the time, said there is a clear work of artistic merit here. That was the trial during which famously the prosecuting counsel said, is this a book that you would wish your wife or your servants to read? So we knew what kind of viewpoints we were dealing with at that time.
Yes.
And so I'd have thought that for the past 60 years, we've had it as a fairly well-established fact that even if you dislike the content of something, it should be allowed to be published. And if you don't like it, you don't have to read it. Retrospectively, to go back and to be trying to, as in the case of Ian Fleming's estate, the writer of James Bond, themselves to be changing the language,
yes,
I think is a very odd thing, because that is a distortion. If you think it's really necessary, if you think your readers are so stupid that they can't understand that books published a long time ago express different points of view in different languages, if you really think it's necessary, then fine, put a little warning on it. But to start rewriting as some authors' estates are doing, I think is a really quite dangerous trend.
I mean, it's interesting, the rewriting thing. I mean, there was a backlash when they were starting to rewriting P.G. Wodehouse.
Yes.
The very idea that these sort of 20-year-old activists pretending to be publishers can write better than Wodehouse is hilarious to begin with. But then there's a difference between that and maybe putting a warning on. But even the warning troubles me.
Yeah.
Because the implication behind it is that these books are sort of potentially dangerous.
Yes.
And that they have to kind of paternalistically look after the public. That's their job. It's not their job.
Well, that in itself is, I think, a rather old-fashioned idea, and it's curious that they should be existing together. Now, I wonder if they would, for instance, support the reinstatement of the role of the Lord Chamberlain, who between 1737 and 1968 had the power to censor any play on the British stage for content in case it somehow offended someone or was obscene or was blasphemous. I mean, it does seem that we are moving backwards in our ability to appreciate a variety of artistic expression. It seems that we're moving towards, again, a time when people can control the thoughts of others because they think it's good for them. And now, who is saying that these people have the right? Why not you or I or your viewers?
Yes.
How is it that these people, this self-selecting guardianship, have decided that only they are morally pure and intellectually strong enough to decide who reads what?
And isn't it fascinating, because they would consider themselves to be progressives.
Yes.
But they're behaving like the Star Chamber or something. They seem like the old-fashioned stuffy pearl clutchers from yesteryear, the ones who took D.H. Lawrence to trial.
Well, I would say it has historical references and resonances with other things like, say, the Inquisition, which people remember the Spanish Inquisition because of Monty Python, but in fact it went on for hundreds of years, and still today there is a list of books that the Vatican has banned. It's prescribed that, you know, they're not being burnt anymore. But we've seen in many regimes throughout history that once ideas are controlled, once there is an idea that some things are so dangerous as ideas that they can no longer be read, you start to go down a very difficult path about the free expression itself. And what concerns me here is that they're beginning with language, they're beginning with those particular touch points of today's language, race and class. And I just don't think that there's a possibility of it ending there. And I think this is another instance where the slippery slope is not a logical fallacy. It's a very clear indication, and we've seen this in so many instances recently. Once control is exerted over language, which is a principal method we have of expressing our ideas, those ideas themselves become circumscribed and indeed proscribed.